Welcome to the store. Don't forget to subscribe, and support me.
In the world of Eleron, a once thriving human kingdom lay in ruins, its people enslaved by the Zealer, a powerful race of sorcerers who had conquered the land centuries ago. The Zealer ruled with an iron fist, their magic bending nature to their will and keeping humanity in submission. From the grand cities to the smallest villages, humans toiled under the weight of chains, their spirits slowly ground down by the Zealer's cruelty. Chris was born into this world of oppression. He had never known anything else. His father had died before he could remember, a nameless face lost in the mines where so many humans perished. His mother had struggled to keep him alive, enduring harsh labor in the fields until her body gave out when Chris was only 10. Now, at 18, Chris worked the same fields where his mother had died, his body lean and hardened by years of backbreaking toil. Yet, despite the endless days of labor, there was a fire inside Chris that refused to be extinguished. He often found himself gazing toward the horizon, imagining a world where his people were free. The stories the elders told, whispered late at night when the Zealer guards were not listening, filled his mind with visions of what once was. They spoke of a time when humans ruled the land, a time before the Zealer had come and brought their magic and their cruelty. One day, while working near the edge of the fields, Chris noticed something unusual, an old stone structure, half buried in the earth. It was barely visible among the tangled vines and overgrown bushes, but Chris's sharp eyes had caught a glimpse of it. His curiosity piqued. He waited until nightfall before returning to investigate. The stone was ancient, weathered by time, and etched with symbols Chris didn't recognize. He brushed away the dirt and vines, revealing more of the structure, a door, slightly ajar, leading into darkness. Heart pounding, Chris pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the darkness. Chris lit a torch and descended deeper into what appeared to be an ancient crypt. His footsteps echoed as he walked down the stone corridor, his eyes scanning the walls for any signs of danger. There was none. The Zealer had no interest in these ruins. Old human structures had long been abandoned, their magic forgotten. But as Chris ventured deeper, he realized this place had not been completely forgotten. At the far end of the crypt, on a stone pedestal, lay a large, leather-bound book. Its cover was blackened and cracked with age, and strange symbols were carved into the binding. Chris felt a strange pull toward the book, as if it were calling to him. He hesitated for only a moment before reaching out and touching it. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, a jolt of energy shot through his body, igniting something deep within him. Chris snatched his hand back, his heart racing. What was this book? He had never seen anything like it, but the power it contained was undeniable. He picked it up, feeling its weight, and as he opened the cover, the ancient words inside seemed to whisper to him. It was a book of fire magic. The realization hit him like a hammer. Fire, one of the primal forces of the world, and one that the Zealer could not fully control. The Zealer's magic was rooted in the manipulation of the elements, but fire was the one force they feared. It was wild, unpredictable, and could not be tamed like the other elements. This book contained the key to harnessing that power, and Chris knew immediately what it could mean. He returned to the fields the next morning, but his mind was elsewhere. He had hidden the book in a safe place, away from prying eyes, and in the nights that followed, he began to study its contents. The spells were complex, written in an ancient tongue that Chris could barely understand, but there was a strange connection between him and the magic. Slowly, he began to grasp the basics of fire magic, summoning small flames in the darkness of his makeshift hideout. As Chris's power grew, so did his desire to free his people. He knew he couldn't do it alone, but he couldn't trust just anyone. The Zealer's spies were everywhere, and one wrong move could mean death for him and anyone who dared to stand with him. But Chris had always been observant, and he knew there were others who shared his desire for freedom. Among the slaves, there was Alara, a woman who had once been a scholar before the Zealer destroyed her village and forced her into servitude. She had a keen mind and was known for her wisdom, even among the other slaves. Then there was Thorin, a grizzled warrior who had survived more battles than anyone could count. He had once led a resistance against the Zealer, but that rebellion had been crushed long before Chris was born. Thorin had been broken by years of defeat, but Chris could see the fire in his eyes, still smoldering beneath the surface. One night, Chris approached them both, revealing what he had found and what he had learned. "You're a fool if you think this magic will be enough," Thorin said gruffly. "The Zealer are too powerful. They've crushed every rebellion before." Chris met his gaze steadily. "This isn't like the other rebellions. This is different." Alara studied Chris carefully. "The magic of fire, it's dangerous, Chris. Unpredictable. It could destroy everything. Or it could save us," Chris replied. "I've seen what it can do. It's our only chance." Alara sighed, her gaze shifting to the horizon. "I don't know, Chris. But I do know this: if we do nothing, we're already dead." With that, the rebellion was born. It started small, with Chris teaching Alara and Thorin what he had learned from the Fire Tome. They practiced in secret, far from the eyes of the Zealer, and slowly began recruiting others. Word spread among the slaves that there was hope, a chance to fight back. For the first time in centuries, the flames of rebellion were kindling. The early victories were small, but they were enough to give the rebellion momentum. Chris and his followers struck at night, sabotaging supply lines, freeing captured slaves, and destroying Zealer outposts. The Zealer, caught off guard by the sudden resistance, scrambled to respond. But Chris's fire magic gave them an edge. The Zealer's magic, powerful as it was, could not fully counter the raw force of the flames Chris wielded. As the rebellion grew, so did the dangers. The Zealer, realizing they were dealing with something far more dangerous than mere insurrection, sent their elite Ashen Guard to crush the rebellion. These warriors were masters of elemental magic, and they had no mercy for those who opposed the Zealer. Chris's band of rebels found themselves outmatched, forced to retreat again and again as the Ashen Guard hunted them down, but Chris refused to give up. Each defeat only hardened his resolve. He spent long nights poring over the Fire Tome, pushing himself to learn more, to become stronger. The magic was dangerous, as Alara had warned, and there were times when Chris feared it would consume him. The fire inside him was growing more difficult to control, and he knew that if he wasn't careful, it could burn everything he had worked for to ashes. The turning point came when the rebellion managed to ambush a high-ranking Zealer lord. The battle was fierce, with the Ashen Guard nearly overwhelming them, but Chris's mastery over fire magic had reached new heights. He unleashed a torrent of flames, incinerating the Zealer lord and forcing the Ashen Guard to retreat. Chris stood over the smoldering remains of the Zealer lord, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his hands trembling as the last of the fire magic faded from his fingertips. Around him, the rebels gathered, their eyes wide with awe and disbelief. They had won, against impossible odds. They had defeated one of the most powerful Zealer in the land. For the first time, the hope that had flickered in their hearts began to burn brighter, fueled by the impossible victory they had just witnessed. But Chris didn't feel triumphant. As the adrenaline ebbed away, the weight of what he had done pressed down on him. The fire magic had surged through him with a ferocity he hadn't expected, barely under his control. He had nearly lost himself in the flames, almost let the power consume him entirely. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, and one that haunted him as the rebels regrouped. Elara approached, her face illuminated by the dying embers. "You did it," she said softly, though there was a note of caution in her voice. "But that was dangerous, Chris. I could see it in your eyes. You're pushing yourself too far." Chris didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the dark silhouette of the Zealers' capital loomed in the distance, the seat of their power, the burning throne. "We don't have a choice, Elara," he said finally. "The Zealer won't stop until they've crushed us. If I don't use this power, we'll never stand a chance." Elara shook her head. "The fire is powerful, yes. But it's also unpredictable. It could destroy us just as easily as it could destroy them." "I know," Chris whispered, his voice heavy with the burden of leadership. "But what other option do we have?" Before Elara could respond, Thorin limped over, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. "We need to move," he grunted, his grizzled face hardened by years of battle. "The Ashen Guard will be back with reinforcements. We can't stay here." Chris nodded, forcing himself to push his doubts aside. He had to keep moving, keep fighting. There was no time to dwell on the dangers of the fire magic, not when his people were depending on him. Over the next few weeks, the rebellion continued to grow. More slaves joined their ranks, inspired by the tales of Chris's victory over the Zealer Lord. Camps were set up in hidden valleys and remote forests, far from the reach of the Zealers' patrols. Each day, the rebels trained, sharpening their skills and learning to fight with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose, but as their numbers grew, so did the strain on Chris. The fire magic demanded more from him with each passing day. It had become a constant presence in his mind, a burning force that surged beneath his skin, waiting to be unleashed. Controlling it required immense focus, and there were moments when Chris feared he was losing that control. Nightmares plagued his sleep, visions of the fire consuming everything in its path, turning both Zealer and human alike to ash. One night, after a particularly brutal training session, Chris found himself alone by a small stream, staring into the flickering flames of a campfire. His reflection in the water was distorted, shadowed by the firelight, and for a moment, he barely recognized the face staring back at him. "I see it, you know," a voice said quietly behind him. Chris turned to see Thorin, his rugged face softened by the glow of the fire. The old warrior sat down beside him, his movements slow and deliberate, the years of battle weighing on his body. "See what?" Chris asked, his voice hoarse from the long day. "The burden you carry," Thorin replied. "The fire inside you. It's not just power, it's a curse, too." Chris didn't respond, his gaze drifting back to the flames. Thorin was right, of course. The fire was both his greatest weapon and his greatest danger. But what could he do? Without it, they were lost. Thorin leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. "I've fought in a lot of wars, seen a lot of men destroy themselves for power. But you're different. You're not just fighting for power. You're fighting for something bigger. And that's what keeps you from losing yourself in the flames." Chris glanced at him, his brow furrowing. "What if it's not enough?" he asked quietly. "What if the fire takes over, and I can't stop it?" Thorin shrugged. "Then we'll deal with it when the time comes. But for now, we need you to lead us. And we need that fire of yours." Chris wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he could control the fire long enough to win this war. But deep down, he knew the truth. Every time he used the magic, he was losing a piece of himself. The next morning, the rebellion prepared for its final assault on the burning throne. The Zealer, aware of the growing threat, had fortified their defenses, calling upon their most powerful sorcerers to protect the capital. It was a daunting task, but Chris knew they couldn't wait any longer. The rebellion had reached its peak. If they didn't strike now, the Zealer would crush them. As the rebels gathered in the pre-dawn light, Chris stood before them, his heart pounding with the weight of what was to come. He looked at the faces of those who had followed him this far, men and women who had risked everything for the chance at freedom. Some of them were little more than children, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We've come a long way," Chris began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I know you're scared. I know you're tired. But today, we take back what's ours. Today, we fight not just for ourselves, but for every human who's ever lived in chains. We fight for our future." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd, but Chris could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They knew the risks. They knew that many of them would not survive the battle ahead. But they also knew that this was their only chance. Chris raised his hand, and a small flame danced in his palm, casting a warm glow over the faces of his comrades. "We are the fire," he said, his voice steady. "And today, we burn away the chains that bind us." With that, the rebellion marched toward the burning throne. The battle was unlike anything Chris had ever seen. The Zealer had prepared for their arrival, and as the rebels charged toward the capital, they were met with a barrage of elemental magic. Lightning crackled through the air, tearing through the ranks of the rebels. Water surged up from the earth, sweeping away entire groups of fighters. But Chris pressed forward, his fire magic cutting a path through the chaos. The closer they got to the throne, the fiercer the resistance became. The Ashen Guard were waiting for them, their faces hidden behind dark masks, their hands glowing with deadly magic. Chris fought with everything he had, flames roaring from his hands as he faced off against the Zealer's elite warriors, but even as he unleashed the full force of his fire magic, Chris could feel the toll it was taking on him. The flames were growing hotter, more intense, and harder to control. Every time he cast a spell, it felt like a part of him was being consumed by the fire. But there was no turning back now. As the battle raged on, Chris found himself face to face with the Zealer King. The ruler of the Zealer was a towering figure, his body draped in robes of deep crimson, his eyes glowing with the power of ancient magic. Chris could feel the weight of the king's magic pressing down on him, a force so immense it nearly brought him to his knees. "You are nothing but a fool," the Zealer King sneered, his voice like thunder. "You think you can challenge me with your pitiful flames? I have ruled this land for centuries. You cannot hope to defeat me." Chris gritted his teeth, his hands burning with the heat of his fire magic. "Maybe I can't defeat you," he said through clenched teeth. "But I can try." With a roar, Chris unleashed the full power of the fire tome, the flames surging toward the Zealer King in a blinding wave of heat and light. The king raised his hands, his own magic forming a barrier against the fire, but Chris could feel the strain in the air. The king's magic was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. The fire raged, consuming everything in its path. Chris pushed harder, channeling every ounce of his strength into the flames. The Zealer King staggered, his barrier cracking under the force of the attack. For a moment, Chris thought he had won. But then, with a deafening roar, the king retaliated, unleashing a wave of dark magic that sent Chris flying backward, his body slamming into the ground. Pain shot through Chris's body as he struggled to his feet. The Zealer King loomed over him, his eyes burning with fury. "You will die for your defiance," he hissed, raising his hand for the final blow. But before the king could strike, a surge of fire erupted from the ground, engulfing him in flames. Chris watched in disbelief as the fire tore through the Zealer King's defenses, consuming him in a blaze of light. It was over. The Zealer King fell to his knees, his body crumbling to ash as the fire consumed him. Chris stood over the remains, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his hands still trembling with the remnants of the magic. The burning throne had been reclaimed.